The 2008 pivot to Asia was an optical shift that had a dramatic impact in the way that the region saw itself and the way that it interacted with each other. When the US decided to disproportionately have foreign and economic policy focus on the Asian region, as opposed to Europe and the Middle East and away from its traditional allies, they changed the way that the region functioned in a way that was incredibly destabilizing. Our alternative in opening government, when we remove this policy, is that we think that the USA should not explicitly disproportionately focus on one region, and it should return its focus in the Asian region to its more traditional allies. I'm going to answer 3 questions for you in this debate. I'm firstly going to talk about why the regional balance works only when the US maintains its traditional allies. I'm going to secondly talk about why this policy fundamentally makes China more aggressive and how that's impossible to prevent. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how other allies feel about the pivot and why that's problematic also in terms of their own actions. But why does the regional balance work only when the USA maintains its traditional allies? We think the regional balance that we're describing is that between the superpowers of Japan and South Korea and the balance between China. We think that that balance is fundamentally something that's very easy to destabilize and something that happened under this policy, therefore it should be revoked. Firstly, we think there is a historic precedent of understanding how the region works with that kind of US backing. Everybody knows that when something happens, they can easily understand what's likely to happen next because there's been decades and decades of the region working that way. This policy broke that. No, thank you. But we also think that there's military balance. Like when the US particularly backs South Korea and Japan, it's easy with treaty guarantees and military backing for weaker states to understand exactly how people will react to certain things. When you also have to support Chinese interests as well, it's very difficult to get that balance at the point at which you don't know exactly how the US will respond to something that's also supposed to be their client. No, thank you. But we also think that economic competition is more even when you don't insert another superpower trying to put extra influence in the region. Like when you have to balance Chinese and Japanese interests, it's very easy to destabilize that balance at the point at which you have to support one over another in some cases. We think that the region is necessarily opposed to each other on some issues. Economic development comes when particularly they're all working in similar industries and in similar growth areas. We think that concessions for one state necessarily often come at the expense of another. The same is true of territorial claims. The same is true of foreign policy wins. So at the point at which the US has to choose sometimes to abandon its old allies in favour of its newer ones, we think that's more difficult. But we think that this policy made China more aggressive, and I'm going to talk to you about why that's something fundamental to the policy and not just the way it was enacted. We think at the point at which a new superpower influence was inserted into the region in a way that was very different from before, when they didn't just focus on Japan and South Korea, but they also focused, no thank you, on China, on Chinese client states. We think that the more trade, aid, backing and support in financial institutions to these states that weren't historically supported was something that made China feel very uncomfortable. We think the US wasn't able to offer enough to China because it was impossible that they could support Chinese interests without also putting their historic partners in jeopardy, which means that in some cases they did that, but in other cases they just weren't able to provide it the kind of support that it would need for China to want to support the policy. So at the point at which the US provides a fundamental threat in backing old enemies like Japan and South Korea, no thank you. We also think that it provides even more threat now under your side of the house at the point at which the Chinese potential client states are also something that the US is disproportionately focusing on, and that makes China feel very uncomfortable. We think, no thank you. When China decides when the US decides that it's going to try and support Vietnam, when it's going to support Thailand, when it's going to support Laos, places that China sees its sphere as influence being, we think that that's something that's very difficult for China to counter. We think that the US is able to offer economic concessions and investment and trade in those countries in ways that China is just simply unable to compete in lots of arenas, and we think that that becomes very problematic. And if it isn't unable to compete and it does so, it also makes it considerably more aggressive. So you have either a world where it's forced to lose its client or it's forced to be super aggressive for its client, which we think makes the entire region more unstable and more dangerous. But we also think, no thank you, that the US is trying to exert political influence on which regimes are even in those countries. So at the point at which the US decides that it wants a Myanmar government that is more one led by Aung San Suu Kyi than by the traditional Chinese rival, we think that that is very unpopular with the Chinese government at the point at which they're unable to do something about it. But we also think that this policy was aggressively pursued and meant that the Chinese had to compete for concessions. No, thank you. But we think that you cannot give China concessions enough without harming other allies in a way that makes them very uncomfortable. We think that China's power and influence is thus under threat by default, and it's unable to maintain its sphere without being super aggressive. So we think under our side of the house, when this changes, they're firstly less at risk because they understand that they don't have this kind of overwhelming influence that they're trying to counter. But critically, they also expect retribution. Like if China fails to control North Korea in the way that America sees fit, and one that's probably more stable for the world, we think that when they know that the US doesn't have to turn a blind eye to China to not aggravate someone that it's pivoted to under this policy, we think it's a lot easier to aid China in containing things that are definitely in US interest, and we think also in the interest of the balance of the regime. I'll take closing.
The traditional approach to traditional allies that you mentioned has been in place since 1945, i.e. the whole of the Cold War includes foreign aid and military boots on the ground. So what exactly are you changing in terms of removing this pivot?
What we're changing is exactly what I just explained. We're not saying that we're changing what's happening in Japan and South Korea. We think that happened before this policy. We're removing the extra pivot that goes toward China and toward Chinese client states. Like we think that was made quite clear in my case. But I'm also now going to talk about what we think other allies feel about in the pivot, because we think that Japan and South Korea have also been upset by this pivot because they didn't have this kind of historic position that you're talking about. They didn't have this historic position of boots on the ground. The same applies to places like the Philippines. Like when they had existing structures that bolstered their regimes against Chinese aggression, we think that necessarily makes them feel weak at the point at which they understand that the US is unlikely to seek this retribution. So at the point at which they know that when the US has pivoted not just towards them but also toward China, it means that they don't feel so secure in the fact that they definitely have that backing. We think that has allowed the Chinese to be particularly aggressive and has made those countries feel more unstable. So at the point at which you understand that the US is also supporting something you consider to be diametrically opposed to yourself, you feel insecure enough that you want to do more to support yourself also. So we think the rise of militarism in Japan that we've seen recently is also something to do with this feeling of insecurity, not just because China has been made to feel aggressive, but also because they don't feel like they have the same support that they used to have from their traditional allies. We think there's a very fine regional balance in the region that was working well until the pivot to Asia. We think this has been something that's destabilized and we'd like to remove it. I'm very proud to propose.
That before the pivot to Asia, everything was balanced and fine. We don't hear any analysis on what that balance was and why it was so amazing. We're going to show you that China was going to hurt the surrounding countries regarding of this pivot, and this pivot is actually a way for the United States to respond and help those countries when they are in need. 2 points, what are China's interests in the South Asian area? Second of all, what happens when the US is there compared to when it is not? First of all, some rebuttal. So the first thing we heard is that this makes things unbalanced and unpredictable. Notice that just saying there was a balance before and therefore any change is unbalanced is just not a very good explanation of how IR works. Right? Before there were countries with a lot of interest that tried to promote their interest, and often it was China trying to promote their interest over the interests of the weaker countries, and we think that the US is predictable in that it is trying to do things to help those weaker countries. Now we create a new balance, which is a better balance. We heard that China is going to be very upset that they are not the most powerful country in the region anymore. We think this is likely true. We think it's good for China to be upset that it is not the strongest country in the region anymore, because we think when it thinks it's very strong, it actually does think to exploit the countries around it and do harmful things to them. Last thing we heard is that Japan and South Korea feel that they no longer have US backing. If they are right in saying that everything we do is making China feel really, really upset and making China weaker, then obviously Japan and South Korea are going to love it. right? Notice that Japan is really afraid of Trump saying he wants to pull away from the Southeast Asian area because they like the backing that they got in the Obama administration era. I'll take you later. Let's talk about China's interests. Right? So we think that China wants to be a strong country and wants to promote its interests. What are those interests? So first of all, China has an economy that is in a very precarious position at the moment. And for several reasons. First of all, because the one-child policy means that right now it has less people to keep to maintain the growth that it had so far up to this point. Because they need to shift from a manufacturing economy which is no longer viable because other countries are outcompeting them in manufacturing and move towards a service-based economy. This shift is hard. It's especially hard when you have a very concentrated market, a huge share of which is owned by the government, and you don't have a lot of competition and a lot of the free market helping you make that shift. It is also very hard because China is just huge, and the difference between the rural areas and the urban areas are very large, and it's hard to get to the rural areas and actually develop them as well. So we think that first of all they want to be a stronger economy. That is one of China's main interests. Second interest that they want is to be a world power. They view themselves as a nation that was once very strong in the past, in the Middle Ages. They have a huge history of being a very strong and meaningful nation. We think that they want to revive that in the current government. The current government relies on the ethos of creating a stronger China and a better China. We think that they want to show that they are strong on the international relations stage, and we also think that obviously they want to maintain their form of government over time and give stability to it. Now, how do we think this translates into things that China does? So first of all, when you want to show that you are a strong country on the world stage, what you usually do is pester the countries around you that seem weak, because you think that is a way to make yourself seem stronger, right? If you can say, I have complete disregard for the West, I can take over the South China Sea because I am that strong and no one can do anything to me, that looks great for them because it shows how strong they are, right? We think that this means that they are likely to be aggressive towards countries that seem weak in their area regardless of what the West would have done. We also think that they try to enforce their economic interests over the area. We think that they don't have a lot of regard for the human rights issues and for the labor rights and all the regulations in those developing markets. We think that they just want to make sure that their economy can keep on developing and keep on growing. This means that when they push economic trade agreements, they push agreements that are going to exploit those weak markets, they're going to exploit the people, they're not going to push for regulations and for better conditions, they're going to just try to take as much resources as they can from those weaker countries in order to make sure that their own economy, which is in crisis, can keep on growing and keep on maintaining. When OG tells you there's a balance so far, this is the balance that exists so far, not amazing. I'll take closing before we continue. I'll take opening.
The pivot to Asia isn't a pivot to all Asian countries except for China. It necessarily involves a set of policies that also appease Chinese interests and mean that the US can't necessarily go in and counter all of these Chinese objectives that you said.
So first of all, appeasing Chinese interests mean we are creating a reliance of China on the United States and a reliance of a shared interest, meaning that it's much harder for China to do whatever it wants because it has the shared interest. Second of all, we think, we're talking about things like the TPP, right? That is a trade agreement that is explicitly aimed at making China weaker in the economic stage and making other weaker countries stronger because they need that help. Let's talk about what happens when the US does this pivot to Asia, right? So we think that what it does is ally itself both diplomatically and economically with all those countries that it wasn't allied with in the past, like we heard from OG, right? What does this mean? So it means that first of all, so we have the economic stage and more like the how they push themselves as a world power. We think that on the economic level, that means that the US is pushing trade agreements that are better. Now we know the TPP is not perfect, it has problems, but compared to what China is going to push, it's much better because China needs those countries to be able to solve the economic crisis that it is facing and promote its economy, and it doesn't care for human rights and for what is happening in those countries, right? We think that the trade agreements that the US pushes is much better on the comparative. We think that also when the United States is allied with these countries, that China knows there's much more consequences if it's going to be aggressive towards those countries, right? Because it knows that it knows that there is economic downsides to that because those countries are not going to work with them, and also because the West, the United States States, which is still a large part of the Chinese exporting economy, is not going to work with them as much, and that means that they're going to lose their economic benefits. And we also think that they know that on the international relations stage, those other countries are not just going to sit by. These countries know that they have the US supporting them. They know that if they are in trouble, they have a stronger country that is backing them, and that means that China is much less likely to be very aggressive to them. So what we're giving you is this. The balance thus far was not a good balance. When the US entered into this stage, it is time to create a new balance that is much better. We are seeing that new balance play out and now saying, no, we are just leaving you right in the middle of the process and go back to being all alone is going to be terrible for those weakest countries that need our help. Please oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech.
Contrary to the characterization that we get from opening opposition, the pivot to Asia was not the advent of a United States presence in the Asian region. They had very natural allies in countries like South Korea and Japan, allies that we think opening opposition probably wants to preserve. The pivot to Asia was a policy that has been happening, or a set of policies rather, that have been happening since 2008 specifically, when the Obama administration decided that this was their strategy in terms of foreign policy in the Asian region. So when they say we need free trade with other Asian countries, that's not necessarily something that has to be a part of the pivot to Asia specifically. If they're talking about things like the TPP, that also includes countries that aren't in the Asian continent and a lot of typical allies that we would have had otherwise. We think that we can probably have similar, if not the same agreements without this specific pivot to going into new areas of the Asian continent that we think only aggravate China, upset that balance, and as my partner tells you, increase the militarization within the region. That means that you get an increased sense of nationalism that's quite toxic in countries like Japan that previously wouldn't have had that kind of relationship. So I'm going to do two things in this speech. First, get into some rebuttal of what we heard from the opening opposition case, explain to you why either it just takes place in a false reality, so it's something that shouldn't be weighed in this round, or secondly, if it does take place in the real world that we're living in, on balance, what we give to you on our side of the house is more important. And then I'll get into rebuilding some of my partner's constructive, although I think a lot of the specific mechanisms as to why she tells you balance is restored were ignored. So let's look at what they told you. They said, look, there wasn't a balance before. There's no way to balance the interests of China. And I think the problem is that when they tell you about the types of countries that they want to go into, they're very vague, right? They're very vague about the way that they think this pivot to Asia has manifested itself. What Kes tells you specifically is that it's manifested itself not only in specific appeasements or turning a blind eye to specific Chinese policies, but also a funding and support of Chinese client states. And when Kes tells you that this is a specific mechanism that aggravates China further, we get no response. We get no response to the fact that if you are aggravating specific states that China wants to maintain their sphere of influence over, that's going to be a huge problem, and that's going to make China act more aggressively. Because when Kes tells you, you either lose your client or you act aggressively to maintain them, that results in two kinds of policies, right? That results in aggressive economic policy, trying to shut them out of that region and shut them out of that kind of development, and that results in aggressive military policy. And we think that that actually makes it much worse for those states within the region, but it also makes it much worse for the representation of the United States in that continent. So the point at which all that they are fueling is this kind of race to get those client states is the point at which I think that you actually spur that aggression much further. So on balance, if we look at a balance of probabilities, I would say the likelihood that China is going to act in an aggressive fashion towards its client states is much, much higher, the point at which they feel like they are going to lose those client states. So if you're weighing those two arguments against each other, I think it's much clearer that places like Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar are much less likely to be safe, the point at which there is a direct incentive to act aggressively or lose those states. So in terms of China's interests, if what they say is so true and China is so attached to this sense of needing to be a regional hegemon, needing to have that presence, and needing to be the most powerful, if the United States is directly going in and, as they say they can, effectively get into these countries and change the way that those countries are structured
structured, that's when you get Chinese aggression. And even if what they are telling you is that these states would be better off if they had set up like democracies and had better working standards, that's probably true, but that's not what they get, right? So you either have somewhat functioning states that have the ability to engage in certain economic policies and certain amounts of trade, or you have states where people are literally in states of violence or where they're not allowed to engage economically at all. So even though this isn't the best case scenario for those individuals, we would argue on proposition that this is a much better case because in the very least they are allowed to engage in trade. In the very least they get some sort of economic infrastructure, some sort of development, and that's actually going to be a good thing for those states. So if we're talking about Chinese interests, I think that on balance we win that. But we also need to engage with the fact that there are allies in the Asian region that the US has had for a very long time that view their interests to be diametrically opposed to the interests of China and to the interests of this aggression. So the point at which you have specific allies that say, hey, for a really long time you were our military support, you were the ones that were supporting us so that China couldn't be as aggressive as they could be, and now this pivot means that you're going into new countries like those client states. It means that you're less likely to have the same kind of voice on issues. For example, I'll take you later, North Korea is the point at which I think actually these states feel more and more abandoned. And crucially for this argument, it doesn't actually matter if that abandonment happened. It doesn't actually matter if those countries actually don't get the same amount of support. What matters is the optics of what those individuals feel the US presence in the region is, because that's what critically results in democratic shifts within those countries, and that's what means you get more support from the Japanese population for more nationalistic policies, the point at which those individuals feel like the US doesn't have their interests at heart anymore, so they need to take back that control, and they need to be the aggressor because nobody's going to do it on their behalf. Go ahead.
Can you name one example of a Chinese client state that has a subservient relationship? I'm going to posit that the vast majority of them have a history of antagonism, like in Vietnam. They fought wars and they really don't like China right now.
Yeah, okay, so they don't have to like China to be a client state. I would say if we're looking at the state of Vietnam, even though there's a huge amount of like disagreement, even though there's a huge amount of historical anger, that doesn't mean that China doesn't have a huge amount of control over the economic and strategic place of that country within the region. Like, if all client states had to want to be a client state, the world would be a very different place than it is right now. I think if you're looking at the fact that these client states are states that probably have a huge dependence on China in terms of their economic policy, in terms of their economic infrastructure and their trade infrastructure, I think that these very clearly are going to be those client states that you're talking about. So let's get into, if we're dealing with the fact that they talk about China wanting to be a world power, that only gives rise to the arguments that my partner talked about. So let's mention a few of those, because Kes tells you specifically that the military balance that occurs in Asia is a very delicate one, and the point at which you pivot to supporting either more allies that are going to be counter to Chinese interests, or you pivot to areas that China previously didn't experience you before, is the point at which you only encourage the kind of militarization that makes skirmishes more likely, that makes instability more likely, and that's going to be really problematic. But the point at which we think aggravating your allies also leads to that rise in militarism means that the US diminishes their role in being able to control those states and control the ability for those states to maintain their stability. So when we think, we tell you under opening government that what you get is more aggression, what you get is less support, and even if in an ideal world China wouldn't have the control that it does, on balance we provide better lives, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for his speech.
So opening government present a rather utopic case. Look, there was one thing that aggravated China so far. It was the US presence in Asia. Take the US away from Asia, everything becomes okay. Economic competition, everybody's happy. What we want to show you in this debate is A, that China would have been aggressive to the states around it, those dear client states that you like so much anyway. Second of all, that China is going to be even more aggressive now that the US reverses its policy. Note, this is not a supports or regrets motion. This is a reverses motion, which means that the power vacuum that will form the sooner soon as the US leaves the area is the crucial message that we need to be talking about in this debate. Several points of rebuttal, and then I'm going to expand about this power vacuum after the reversal. So first they tell us, we want to have more like equal economical competition in the area. Note that if your characterization from OG is correct, and it is a zero-sum game on territory, on resources, and everything in the East Asian area, then basically there will not be any equal economical competition because China will utilize its power against those client states, against Japan, whose military hasn't formed just yet, and will utilize this power vacuum to become even more dominant in the area. So we don't get that. Now, they tell us that the pivot to Asia made China angry. Note that no engagement with my partner's analysis on how China would have been angry and aggressive anyway, because they have encountered an economical crisis that had nothing to do with the US presence there, and it desperately needs to encourage its country ethos, get the support of its people, and make sure that it reinforces its ethos as a strong country. Now note this, it means crucial things for those client states you care about so much, because if there's a power vacuum in the area, China is desperate for economic improvement. What is it going to do? It is going to basically, like, I'm going to use like big words here, but nothing short of enslave those weaker countries to trade agreements, to trade policies that will basically leave them unable to recuperate and form independent economic like systems that the US is allowing them to form, that the US is supporting. They tell us that China can make Vietnam fall right now. We don't see how that's going to happen if the US is backing them up and if Vietnam doesn't like China anyway. When the US backs out of the area, that is when China has sole control, gets the message from the US that the US doesn't want to intervene. China, you can do whatever the hell you want in Asia. That is when it can drop, make Vietnam drop. Now they also tell us that the US intervenes in those regimes. Now let's put the comparative here. We think that the comparative of China intervening in those regimes is absolutely worse than the US because China has a lot more of a direct interest to exploit these countries. The US cares less about the area directly, and that China is not even like listening to international forces like the Permanent Court of Arbitration, like the UN, like anything that might mitigate its influence in the area. So we think that if we have countries intervening in client states anyway, we would rather it be the US because they're more likely to be like curtailed by other international forces rather than China that cares about its own interests. Now they also tell us, wait, the pivot to Asia included stuff that make China happy as well. So I'm not sure why this policy actually made them angry if it included things that make them happy. I'm not even sure what your characterization of the pivot to Asia is. If the pivot to Asia made them happy, let's stay there because it means they will be less aggressive. If the pivot to Asia made them not happy, it is good that we stay there because they need to be scared of the US and not like enslave those other weaker states. Now, they tell us this harms the ability of China to control those client states as it is right now. We think, A, this is a good thing. We would rather China not go into Vietnam, Myanmar, Philippines, all of those states that are very vulnerable because their economies haven't become fully fledged yet. We would rather the US be there helping them rather than China exploiting them to every single win that they have. They say, no, China is going to be more aggressive under the pivot to Asia. This is when we get to talking about the power vacuum. Because again, we need to notice what kind of message China receives from the reversal of a policy that has been practiced for almost for more than a decade so far. So what does this happen? Basically, four things are going to happen. First of all, China is going to utilize this for its national ethos. Look, we have done many things in Southeast Asia. The US is weak, the US is retreating, they have realized that they cannot take us. This is a propaganda move that will be utilized by the strong, concentrated Chinese media in order to strengthen the power of the local regime, which is A, not very good for the people in China. Basically, my partner analyzed why the regime in China exploits the human rights of its own people, which we already think is a bad thing in this debate. We don't want to strengthen this forceful narrative of China. But basically, it also means that it enforces China's incentive to exploit other states in the region to make more powerful moves, which is the second thing that is going to happen. Because under the pivot to Asia, China made very forceful moves in the South China Sea. There were actual violent clashes there with US boats literally situated in the South China Sea. What happens when the US boats leave the South China Sea? Even worse things, because Japan's military hasn't actually formed yet. There is no real power, military power, in Asia that it can right now counteract what the Chinese currently has. Given that the Chinese know that we've invaded the South China Sea so far, nothing happened. Not only nothing happened, but the US actually retreated. That means we are a superpower. That means we can do whatever the hell we want in the region. That means we can take those islands, exploit their resources, and negate any claim Japan has to ever making itself a real power in Asia. This also means that it is going to exploit those client states that OG cares so much about. Why is that? Two reasons. First of all, because now China has full control over the economical situation in the region. Who takes part in trade agreements? Where the Silk Route goes? They're actually building a trade route alongside East Asia, and they can decide which country will be part of it and which country will be completely excluded from the Asian trade of the next decades. What are the terms of these agreements? China can decide completely. I want to take closing.
If the region is so important to China, why would they have an interest in completely destroying it and just kind of finishing off every state that's within it?
Yeah. Okay. Let's characterize here. You assume that China will be like sadistically destroying it? No. Note that the word is exploiting, enslaving. Think sweatshops, only more than that. Think everything that China can do to those countries, its manpower, its infrastructures, the factories that the US has supported there so far, in order to rehabilitate its failing economy. It is failing to transition from manufacturing to a service industry. That means that it will make desperate moves that will be at the expense of other people in weaker states to reinforce its power. So once China has full control over the economical state in those countries, it also becomes a role model in the diplomatic sense, because those countries receive a very clear message. The US doesn't care about you. China is the power in the region. That means they're more likely to pivot around China as a role model for what a state, an economic model, and a political model is supposed to be like. That means that we get shifts away from democratic powers because the US is no longer likely to back those countries. Note also that those countries has made already several moves to pivot towards the US. They sent diplomats there. They signed bilateral investment treaties. They signed like actual agreements between those states. What is China likely to say now that they have full control over those countries that they know have expressed alliance with the US until now? They're likely to be very angry at those countries, utilizing their country ethos of we were a superpower, do not mess with us, in order to not only exploit those countries economically, but also backlash at them on the diplomatic level. So because we harm the client states that OG cares about so much, and because the power vacuum is going to leave Southeast Asia very harmed, even if the initial pivot to Asia wasn't ideal, please oppose.
Here is why closing opposition will win this debate. Opening government, and to an extent closing government's case, goes as follows. China simply isn't that bad of a superpower, so in the long run it is good for countries to acquiesce with it. This speeds that up. Opening opposition says China is really, really bad, terrible standards, terrible people all around, shouldn't cooperate with them. But I think it is always ambiguous, and history is yet to conclusively determine which superpower was better, even in the Cold War, even right now. I don't think you can ever know that or prove that, because for every terrible Chinese trade deal, I can probably point to an example where the US was quite exploitative as well. So the tipping point in this debate is what is good for the region. A region mired by historical underdevelopment and conflict between differing nations. We're going to show you on both these counts that the world gets better in places like Southeast Asia and in East Asia as a result of the competition that Sophie has already signaled to you thus far. Rebuttal is going to be integrated. But note, closing government's extension is broadly themed around the idea that there is a struggle for influence and that leads to conflict. There is a jump there. In the past, in the Cold War, there was a struggle for influence, but we rarely, if ever, saw that as a direct conflict between superpowers. It was about conflict zones with pre-existing conditions. No, thank you. So, the first extension I have, therefore, is to walk you through China's decision-making process, show you why the way they compete is not going to be militarily, but economically, and why that is a good thing for the region. Note, the first half of this extension makes a simple claim that with a US pivot, China can no longer get easy de facto military wins. That's the strategy of big powers like Russia and China, to take over an area de facto before the US can respond quickly or anyone else can respond and say, now that we've taken over, it's very hard internationally, or diplomatically, or militarily to dislodge us from that area. Why is this the case? What changes now is that the US is a tripwire force, making it more likely that they will commit fully if there are US deaths on the ground. Second of all, or I guess in this case, on the seas. Second of all, the US can respond quicker with a fleet that is in the region as opposed to further abroad. So you don't get that sort of de facto claim, no thank you, that happens so quickly. But third of all, there is less of a power imbalance. The reason why Russia can do all sorts of things to the small states on its borders is because there is simply no one backing them up with any form of credible threat whatsoever. China would have, if you listen to opening government, that sort of power imbalance over Laos, over Myanmar, no thank you, over Cambodia, over Vietnam, over the islands, whoever disputes the islands in the South China Sea. There is a drawn-out diplomatic cost that happens on our side that simply doesn't happen on their side. So note, we accept China will feel pressure to compete, but the response here won't be militarily, because a military attack or a military solution often results in a stalemate. It looks terrible for China. They become invested in a region, forced to defend it back and forth. No, thank you. It looks terrible for them internationally on the global stage at places like the UN. They know that the US will be able to, at the very least, prolong and draw out this conflict. They might do things like place sanctions, which if you listen to opening government and accept that the economy of China is truly as important as it is, that's a lose-lose situation for everyone. You simply don't get a clear enough win for China with the pivot to take this sort of unilateral action. The comparison, no thank you, and I'll get to this in just a moment, is economic, because those things don't require the same types of costs that are drawn out. The One Belt, One Road response, the Asian Development Bank, in a sort of surprising recursion to the partial octo from last year as well. So, the conclusion here is that this is on net good for client states. 3 observations. First, as I've told you, China doesn't compel obedience via the military. To the extent that there are client states, they compel obedience via offering better terms than what the US can offer. Second of all, China does so by increasing aid, which is good. Now, Oji and both gov benchers have said things to this. Oji says that this is a form of aggression. Cool, it's aggressive, but it's aggressively selling a type of economic development. It's aggressively selling an option and telling people that this is good for them. There's a competition to improve things like human rights standards on their side of the house if the US offers a better alternative, i.e. the TPP, and sort of leading to the type of independence that the One Belt, One Road policy was able to give these small states. Finally, if OG is right and the US offers deals that China simply can't beat, I posit this is good for those states. They were previously client states because they had no choice. Now they have a superior option that China cannot beat. To the extent that some teams in this debate think China is a bad thing, we give these client states an alternative. So, opening government's definition of a client state is not a state that China sees, has a good relationship with and is currently controlled by China. It is a definition that says China forces these states into a state of servitude. So this begs the question, why is this a good thing? On our side of the house, we show you why that state of being a client, that situation of being a client state, so to speak, is not necessarily one that has to be preserved. That the US can provide a reasonable alternative that brings about growth and development in the region, either directly or by infusing a greater deal of competition in terms of the terms of trade, the terms of aid, and the terms of development. Go ahead.
If, like you say, the US will probably win because they have better standards, why does China compete benevolently? Why don't they compete by flooding markets, by shutting out of agreements that they might want to be in, and by being aggressive so that they can't engage economically?
Because then those things just don't endear a people to you, right? Like if you're not going to coerce them and take over their economy, and the US is providing them a lifeline, like the only way you can get them to return to your side and your sphere of influence is to offer them better terms. It's just not clear to me why any of those strategies would be useful going forward. Now my second argument is going to be about conflict. That this destabilizes the region when the pivot is taken away. And note, this is a region that's quite dear to my heart. I literally served in an armed force that is relevant at this point. 2 things to note here. Number 1, the US military, when entrenched in a region, wants support from that region. Things like logistical support, things like being able to have training exercises with allies, or at the very least friends. They don't have to be official allies, but they can often be sort of de facto allies or de facto partners in a military alliance. So let me list you some of these countries. Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, Thailand. All of these countries have had recent military exercises and cooperation, not just with the US itself, but together as a bloc. Now, why does this happen? I think, as I've suggested, the US has an incentive to make this happen as the dominant coordinating power in the region. Very often, these mutual training exercises are brokered by the US out of self-interest because you've got to keep a militarily active force active. You've got to keep them prepared, you've got to keep them ready. So the US uniquely underpins this coalition. And why is this coalition so unique? If you think about it, all of these countries used to hate the fucking shit out of each other. There is no conceivable world in which, without the US coordination, Singapore, a country which was bombed by Indonesian saboteurs in the height of the Cold War over confrontasi, a struggle for Muslim Islamic dominance in the region, would say, yes, let's let our militaries cooperate together. But that happened just last year. Likewise with Cambodia and Vietnam, or Thailand and Malaysia, who share a disputed border over the Patani Muslims. The impact here might seem small, but don't understate it. The impact of exercises over a prolonged period of time, since 2008, is understanding. It is a mutual understanding and cooperation between armed forces. But more importantly, it is an integration of those armed forces. When there are things like sharing tactics, like sharing training, you don't want to risk war because you know that they'll have information about your armed forces that you could have previously kept secret. So, it raises the cost of these small countries, small relative to the US, in instigating conflict in the region. The US uniquely is the broker that holds this alliance together. Literally nothing else about their history says they have any reason to cooperate. You take that away on your side, you make the region worse. Proud to oppose.
I think the speaker
what are the most likely outcomes from this model. So when we reverse the pivot to Asia strategy, what are the most likely outcomes? Who can analyze this best to you? We believe from Closing Government that the most important part in this debate, and what we prove to you in this debate, is to give you a differentiated characterization not only of China's role within the region, but also on an international stage where we have to think about power balance and how dynamics are playing out. We believe that what Christoph gave to you was a further analysis, not just staying at the where are they getting more aggressive level, which we had in the first half basically, but rather enhancing this level onto explaining to you why we have positive potential in how China is going to react and act within the international situation we're in right now, and why it is more likely that we can use this positive potential if we actually reverse the strategy, and that was our unique contribution to this debate. The comparative in this debate is that opposition side has to defend in front of you that we have a continuation of extremely negative dynamics in the region but also internationally, which are often coming from out of China, and that have the potential for worsening if we don't withdraw and kind of leave them their influence sphere. And on our side of the house, the comparative is to give you a change in political orientation towards China and the positive potential that we can actually gain from this change, because we have seen for almost 10 years now that the pivot to Asia strategy has only brought worsening dynamics, and this is what they have to defend in the end. But before I come to all of these points, just a few points of direct rebuttal to closing opposition, because they actually nicely clash with us directly. They didn't really realize, but we are actually like the clash that you see in the second half, right? So they're telling you that China's competition is most likely not to be militarily, but rather economically. Please note that we see in the South China Sea, where they have a direct clash with the US military presence, there we see that they are very, very much aware and very, very open to competing militarily rather than economically. Please note that economic competition is more easy for you as a superpower if you have a stable region where you're very secure about your influence, because this is when you actually want to invest in infrastructure, because you're sure that USA is not just going to jump in and have a better trade agreement with these countries, because it's actually worth putting all that effort into stabilizing the region, building up infrastructure. This is what Christoph brought to you, and they never explained to you why under status quo we do see a lot of military engagement from China, if this is their mechanism at this point. But second of all, also a competition to improve human rights if the US actually gives an alternative. Here also we have to look at status quo dynamics and developments on the international stage, where it's actually quite interesting. Many people were very surprised to see that China all of a sudden is very, very engaged in the global climate kind of development and how we can improve that. We believe that the most likely analysis why this is the case just right now was that they were not cornered as much anymore. Before, they were seen like by the US and by European actors, they were always kind of portrayed as this very bad actor that gives like a very bad role model in terms of how to secure the climate. We see that now the focus has shifted because the US are actually reacting and acting in an almost worse way under Trump. We see that now China suddenly felt more secure in stepping in and actually taking the role, the positive role of saying we're also for enhancing climate security globally. We believe that we see that direct clashes with the US as the better actor and as this kind of marvelous kind of savior for the world. This actually led to China being more reluctant to step in and have a positive contribution. Now we see that they see there is actually space for them on the international sphere to take on a positive role, and they're very willing to do so. We believe if we take this further, one step further, and give the signal that Christoph explained to you by saying we're actually stepping away from the influence sphere, we're kind of leaving this up to you, that we can actually see more positive developments as we have seen already in the status quo. So this is where we directly clash with the closing side later. Alright, so what did Christoph bring to you as a direct analysis of how this works? He explained to you that we have different power balance situations internationally. We have seen in the Cold War where we have seen like a bipolar world, but where both of those powers were competing to be a unipolar world, so the only power in this world. That was quite reasonable for the US to try and kind of drive back Russia as an actor, because they were so much stronger than them. It was very feasible for them to actually become a unipolar actor in this international sphere. It is very different under China, and this is where we are more differentiated than the rest of this debate, because we explained to you that China is actually not on an economic breakdown as opening opposition is trying to tell you. They have the best economic development that Western states can only dream about. They are actually like getting more and more engaged with this kind of trade route going towards the West or whatever, where they actually show that they're getting more and more engaged economically and that they have the capital. They also have an extreme extreme military capability where the USA is never going to be able to push them away completely and become the only power in the world. So how can we get the most positive benefits out of the situation? That is exactly what Christoph analyzed to you. By acknowledging that we have to deal with the situation as it is in the status quo, by showing China that we will actually acknowledge them as a possible positive actor, by giving them their influence sphere, because as long as they're under threat, they will compete militarily because they have to still signal their strength. As soon as you give them the signal that you actually kind of respect certain influence areas as their influence area, we actually see that there is a positive potential also in the region. I will go on further on that. Quickly, your question.
China's internal ethos and economical incentives mean that aggression will persist nonetheless. On your side, you add exploitation.
All right,
and backlash.
thanks a lot. Under status quo that you have to defend, China is extremely aggressive towards the state in its region. Why is that so? Because even though China would be a lot stronger and they wouldn't need aggression in order to overpower them, the US is kind of making this balance, getting this balance out of the balance and kind of arbitrarily supporting, or like out of the perspective of China, arbitrarily supporting certain allies in China's influence region. We believe we have analyzed to you we have given you a more plausible analysis from Christoph's side that China actually has a very strong incentive to have a stable region around it. It is very highly unlikely, what opposition side is trying to analyze to you, that they will try to kind of crush all these states and enslave them all and just like extract wealth out of them. We have seen in colonialism that this hardly ever works. It's not very sustainable to just extract and never give back. We have seen in modern times that building up infrastructure that actually works and that building up stability in regions is actually the most profitable economic vision that you can have. So we don't have to explain to you that China is a great person or great country and has only kind of very altruistic goals. We can explain to you that they act mainly economically, mainly after profit, and it's still more profitable for them and makes more sense to have a stable region, have a positive impact. We have shown to you that also on the international stage, we see that as long as you don't corner them and give them their influence sphere, they can act as a positive actor. We're extremely proud to propose this motion.
In this debate. But what we told you in closing government is that really that aggression is a desire to gain control, and the particular means that China would choose to gain control, given the risks of going in militarily and given the analysis we gave that we're on responding to, would be broadly beneficial for the region. The first thing I'm going to do is explain how our extension fits into all other teams in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to respond on the terms of the other teams and explain why we make that region more secure immediately. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the development of the most vulnerable countries in that region. Firstly, why is our extension important? There are three observations to make here. Firstly, if opening government's framing here is right, that this debate is about who best protects the non-traditional allies of the US, we best protect them when we allow for their economic stability, for their economic growth. The second thing to say is we were independent and broadly agnostic on the question of whether the US or China were preferable. Both have done pretty bad things in their past, and we think are likely to do pretty bad things in their future as a superpower. The last thing is, if either side is right here, we still win out if that question needs to be answered. Because if China is bad, in the long run, these states are given the resources, the economic clout, and the military experience to resist China. And if the US is bad, they're given those same resources through the process of those competing superpowers to be empowered against the US. So let's look at the content of those debates with those three things in mind. Firstly, on security. No. A large part of this question of security came out as how would China react? Opening government says China will back down if there's a reversal. Closing government gives the flip side of this, which is pretty similar, by saying China will expand if it doesn't back down. Opening opposition says there's internal pressure within the Chinese, things like media, things like a national ethos. Two things to say about this in closing opposition. The first is, no team really explains why this particular reversal is a tipping point that either means that China will behave differently or not. No, they just give you broad reasons why the particular positioning of Chinese political organizations might be one way or another, not that it would react differently to this. But the second thing is, without any epistemic insight into the minds of the CCP or Chinese elite in this debate, closing opposition breaks this by analysing the proximity to the navies to things like the Senkaku Islands, the unwillingness of China to do things like risking all-out war with a nuclear superpower. That's why we win that first question, no, and didn't rely on these kind of broad questions, saying words like media or saying words like, national ethos. Secondly, the top half of this debate told us that the opening government wanted to protect an old balance of power and opening opposition wanted to protect a new balance. Similarly, closing government rephrases this balance to a question of bipolarity or unipolarity. I think that's pretty similar to the framework of balance, but there's a couple of things we want to say in CO about this. The first thing is, there's no reason why this House should take a Taoist yin-yang attitude to any particular kind of balance. It's not like, we might be in East Asia, guys, but balance is not synonymous with good in this debate. We think if a movement of balance of both states competing to provide the best terms to the countries that these teams agreed they wanted to have as client states, that would be something that, if we're temporarily imbalanced, would be good. But secondly, no, we think balance is best protected by the pivot to Asia. In a point of information to the Prime Minister, we observed that this policy is an extension of the broader US policy since 1945 of extensive economic aid through things like the Marshall Plan, of military support, and as China is stepping up the terms it is offering to these countries, so should the US in order to do this. The last thing that closing government says, and this is where they're most distinct, is they kind of, in order to prove that there is a genuine security risk, appeal to examples they could not provide. They claim that there have been clashes in the South China Sea. Really, panel? I think it's far more likely that the traditional allies that Gov mech'd in protecting, things like Chinese Taipei or Taiwan, whatever you would call it, a place that China, or a country I was about to say, cares a lot more about than some islands in the middle of the South China Sea, are as likely such that it is not the tipping point that everybody claims but nobody proves it actually is. Things like the Jiaoyu Islands, which presumably Govbench is still likely to protect, is far more likely given its proximity to the coast of China. And that's just to say that, firstly, given none of these states had an incentive to clash, the huge political costs that it would incur and the huge costs that it would incur for a direct clash between the US and China, this isn't just skirmishes between fishing boats in like the Philippines, guys. This is the closing government claiming there have been crossfire between the US and China. That, in the absence of the information CG didn't provide, you should err without structural analysis instead of that. I'll take opening in a second, but at the end of this point, we think the security risks here are broadly, marginally, and if changed at all, changed in a more secure way by the pivot to Asia, we would protect that new balance. Opening.
Surely China becomes militaristic when now there's not only economic competition, but you're literally training client-state armies alongside training traditional allies like Japan and South Korea.
A large part of the pivot to Asia was also economic policy. China similarly has incentives to provide its own security agreements to these countries. We're happy if it does that, if it makes that region more stable. The point is, they're never going to clash directly, as we've already proved. Firstly, on economic cooperation. I think here, the debate isn't again about who is good or bad economically. So when Rory earlier peer-wide, China will flood the market, so what? Everyone gets much cheaper products. The answer to that question is not independent of the pivot to Asia, because who is good is dependent on who else is competing with that. We told you China would be more likely to respond economically, further responding to that PY, which did not deal with any of Texas' analysis for a couple of reasons. Where there are no clear military wins to be gained, where there are huge risks in military responses, and where the countries that you're trying to curry favour with by opening government's own analysis are looking for economic gains, China is going to be offering them. That means you see things like the One Belt, One Road thing, investment in the Gwadar port in Pakistan, the AIB and ASEAN. And to the extent that they make some claim about China being worse because it had poor human rights records in economic deals, they improved that through a competition for what those deals could provide instead of surrendering those states to the only power around them. The second thing we told you in our extension is that the kinds of political and interstate cooperation that might have been like military here, it was good. That looked like things like training exercises and economic integration. The
important thing here, and responding a little bit more to Rory's POI, is that realistically, the likelihood of the US and China going to war is relatively small here. What you have at the moment are current and existing conflicts that existed for generations that US support through the pivot to Asia helps to resolve. Border skirmishes on, for instance, the Thai-Burmese border are far more likely in CO, as we told you, than anything happening in the South China Sea, and that is something that is more crucial to more people. You should care about that more. Speaker, CO was best for the countries that we cared about most in this debate, particularly when we did not know if the US or China were better. We made them both better. Proud to stand in CO.